Hello, friends. We'll start in just a couple of minutes. Hello, hello. So great to have everybody here. I don't say see everyone anymore because everybody always gets nervous that I can see into your space. Feel free to have your cameras on or cameras off, totally up to you. But let's go ahead and get started. These are short webinars. I like to jump right in. I've got chat open, so if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and drop it over there. But this is the first of a three-part series. So this is what I'm calling our Courageous Transformation series, which sounds really big when I reread it. I picked the title and I was like, wow, that sounds really exciting, even for me. But this is really a deep dive into what it looks like to actually transform, whether that's ourselves, whether that's a career move that we're trying to make, something about our lifestyle we're trying to change. What does it actually take to get us there? And so one of the starting points for this is imposter syndrome. And this is something that I'll get into the definition of, but this is really something that's foundational to understand and have some strategies around so that it doesn't become a block for you later. Now, like it says up on the screen, drop any questions into the chat. You can direct them just to me so they don't go out to everybody. I'll keep your name private so you don't feel like I'm sharing all your innermost secrets if that's what you choose to send over to me. But if you have any questions, I'll weave it in along the way. So I want to start out with a fast fact. If you remember the after school specials that were like the more you know, and there were these little knowledge bits designed to impart wisdom, primarily to after school kids that are, maybe latchkey kids, that kind of thing, that were home and watching TV. But they always had these little bits of information that were really helpful for something that you needed to know to succeed in life. So talk about ambitious. Well, one of the pieces that I think is really relevant when we begin to talk about something like imposter syndrome is this. Research shows up to 80% of the thoughts that we have in a day are negative. Up to 80%. Now, that's a whole lot more than I even thought it would be, even with my own kind of internal monologue. So it's important that when we start to work with imposter syndrome and when we start to try and untangle the little pieces so that it doesn't become something that's preventing us from moving forward, have some cognizance around the fact that up to 80% of the things that you're thinking about are actually negative in a day. And so build some awareness there so you kind of filter some of that out, or at least ask some intelligent questions about it as you move forward. So let's talk about what imposter syndrome is and how it's defined. So, one definition of it is this persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts or skills. Another definition, a person with imposter syndrome has an exaggerated sense of doubt about their achievements and fear that others might expose them as frauds. It's also an internal experience of believing you're not as competent as others perceive you to be. And so what happens is, it's kind of happening in between our own two ears, and we don't really share about this a lot. And it's also a psychological condition that is characterized by persistent doubt concerning one's abilities or accomplishments, accompanied by the fear of being exposed as a fraud, despite evidence of one's ongoing success. And so I lay these out as sort of just having a framework for you to understand what might be going on kind of in your own psychology, but what might be going on also for people around you. Understanding that, there might be evidence to the contrary, and that's really still not enough for us to feel super confident or like we're kind of owning our own awesomeness. It's also a very internal experience, which means sometimes we're reluctant to get help or to talk about it with other people. And that exaggerated sense of doubt is really, it's why I call it the insidious nature of doubt. It kind of gets in and undermines our foundation. And it might start in one place or like this little kind of small trickle, but then it's going to escalate over time. So that's why it's important to spend some time really building some good strategies about how we deal with this. Now, where do we find imposter syndrome? Where does this show up? Everywhere. It shows up everywhere. And it's going to show up differently for other people, differently for you, even at various times of your life. But it could be at home, it could be at the gym, it could be at the coffee shop, it could be at work, it could be in the middle of a presentation to management, whatever it is. So understanding that it is and can be pervasive for some of us, and it might not just be relegated to one area, or it may be. Let's focus on some strategies. So what the heck do we actually do about this? And this is really going to be the bulk of what I wanted to share with you in this little mini kind of webinar. 5 strategies, that's what we're going to go through today. So in the next 25 minutes or less, 24 and a half minutes or less, we're going to cover 5 ways that you can start to work with imposter syndrome if it's something you're dealing with, or these might be strategies that you share with somebody else. So number one of my favorite phrases, notice what you're noticing. Notice what you're noticing. And what I mean by this is have a little bit more self-awareness when you're, coming into your work days or you're bumping into something that doesn't feel good, or, that confidence gets shaken, whether it was an actual event or a perceived or imagined event that's kind of shaking that. Just have some attention on it when that happens, because this is what will help you stay out of the spiral. So I refer to my thought process when I get into imposter syndrome's clutches as sort of my spiral of death, my spiral of thought death, if you will. So one, notice what you're noticing. Notice it when it starts to happen. I've gotten to the point where I recognize it a little bit faster before I'm like, face down on the middle of the floor in the living room at the end of the day. And then spot it and stop it. So spot and stop. If you start to notice this spin happening, say, spot it. And I actually say this out loud, sometimes in the middle of the grocery store, if that's where the churn is happening. And then you can say out loud, stop. That puts you into a point of control rather than be kind of swept up in this spiral and sort of going down the tube. It allows you to kind of step out of it. It doesn't always completely interrupt or stop the thought process, but it will interrupt it long enough for you to be really intentional about what you do next. And that's where the next 4 strategies come in. So number 2, start to tame those thoughts. This is a set of tools that comes from therapy, or acceptance and commitment therapy. It was developed by Stephen Hayes. Really amazing, very comprehensive set of therapy tools, but this is just a subsection of it. When you notice you're having that set of thoughts, imposter syndrome, doubt, concern, worry, fear, whatever it is for you, try saying, I'm having the thought that. So instead, before you think the thought, so instead of thinking the thing like, I'm going to screw this up, or, oh my gosh, everyone's going to figure out I shouldn't have gotten hired for this job, or I'm going to blow this presentation. Try saying, I'm having the thought that I'm going to blow this presentation. I'm having the thought that I can't resolve this issue. I'm having the thought that I don't deserve this job. And what that does is it just starts to separate you from your thought just a little bit to give you a little bit of room for objectivity in there. So instead of, us being one with our thoughts and like, we are our thoughts, we're actually not. We're actually separate from that. And this gives you a little bit of distance. The second step in ACT, the acceptance commitment therapy, with this tool is I notice I'm having the thought that. I notice I'm having the thought that I'm horribly unqualified to be leading this team. I notice I'm having the thought that I'm going to make a huge mistake and get fired. I notice I'm having the thought that I'm going to blow this interview that I'm up for. And what that does is that actually takes you 2 steps farther removed. So you've identified it as a separate thought, not yourself. It's not intrinsically identified with you as a human being. You've noticed it, and then you're getting that additional space. So it's a thought, and now I've noticed that I'm having the thought. It seems simple, but try saying it 3 times, and it'll kind of lift you out of that direct connection that can be really painful and kind of scary. Third step with ACT, give it a title. So whatever that thought or that set of thoughts is, often they'll come kind of in a grouping of thoughts, if you will. See if you can title it something as if it were a chapter of a book of your memoirs, or if it were a title of a podcast or the name of a song, something that a piece of art that you might create. See if you can give it a title. So I'll give you an example. So when I struggle with imposter syndrome, that often pops up when I'm creating a webinar series that I give a really big title to, like Courageous Transformation. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to talk about this. I'm excited. And then it starts to come up and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm a fraud. So my set of imposter syndrome-ish type thoughts, I call them my I'm a fraud thoughts. And so I'll say, okay, I'm starting to feel nervous, anxious, unsure, like maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Okay, I'm having the thought that I'm a fraud. I'm having the thought that I'm a fraud. 1 step back. I notice I'm having the thought that I'm a fraud. I notice I'm having the thought that I'm a fraud. And then the 4th step that you can do, and this is going to sound really silly, but it's super fun. And I tell you from experience, it works really, really well, is put it to music. So some people might use like Happy Birthday, like a really common tune, Jingle Bells, something like that, that you kind of know, really intrinsically. So you're saying like, I'm a big fraud today. I'm a big fraud today. I'm a big fraud. Everyone knows it. I'm a big fraud today. And you've put it to music. Singing it will make you feel silly, like I do right now. There's no imposter syndrome about how bad my singing voice is. It will make you feel silly, but in doing that, it gives a different way to look at that thought. Like, well, what if the thought itself is silly? What if, my fears around this are actually, kind of silly? So it's going to lighten that mood. Now, I'll give you feel free to borrow this if you have an I'm a fraud thought. I went ahead and put it to Michael Jackson's Bad. So that's how this comes up for me. So I will actually sing when I notice I'm having the fraud thought, because I'm a fraud, I know it, they know it. And I'm like, this is stupid. I feel stupid saying this out loud. I feel stupid telling people about this. Maybe that's actually kind of a silly thing to think. So that's an actual tool. That's not one I developed. That was Dr. Stephen Hayes' acceptance commitment therapy. But try, I'm having the thought. I notice I'm having the thought. Give it a title so that it's sort of a something separate, and then put it to music and make yourself sing it. It's a little ridiculous and it'll be enough to kind of boost you out of that. Number 3, third strategy, get real with your research. One of the challenges with imposter syndrome is that it's often unquestioned, right? So it's a thing that happens between our own 2 ears. It's that internal experience. We don't really want to share it a whole lot with other people. So we don't really talk about it. And what happens then is we have one single and frankly pretty narrow viewpoint on the actual topic itself. So if I say, I'm going to mess up this presentation to management, the board of directors, city council, whatever your industry is, whatever your context is. And my imposter syndrome kicks in, and 80% of those thoughts we have in a day are negative. What comes in with those negative thoughts, I'm going to blow this, is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias starts to say, well, sure you are, because you screwed up that one presentation when you were in 7th grade and it was terrible. And you messed this up, and it'll find little pieces of evidence to support that belief. That's something that our minds naturally do. So getting real with your research means you're not even working on letting go of your own story about it, but you're actually adding in additional data points. So most of the time, high achievers are like, give me the numbers, show me the data. I want quantitative, not just qualitative. Like, let me actually make the business case. This is a way to do that, but for your own imposter syndrome thoughts. So number one, write it down. I am going to blow this presentation. Okay, we know that's what it is. Go ahead and get it out of your head. What's all the evidence that that's true? Now start a column to the opposite. I am going to do well at this presentation. What's all the evidence that actually supports that instead? Because I would be pretty sure, for the most part, most of your evidence is actually going to be completely to the contrary. If you're giving yourself a fair shake, you're really looking back, when did you actually blow the presentation that somebody else told you did? Not what your fears are about it, but use other people's experience there. And that's why that second bullet point says ask for input. It's a great place to hear from other people so that they can help inform your perspective and get you out from in between just being in your own 2 ears. Right. Strategy number 4. I put 3. Number 4. Still learning to count. Leave the gremlins on the table. One of my challenges that I have run into personally over, really decades of trying to work on this for myself, but also with honestly every single one of my coaching clients, is that there's a desire or a thought that we need to completely eliminate anything about imposter syndrome in order to have succeeded in dealing with it, banishing it, moving past it. And so there's this perceived ideal state that's available that is completely free of any thoughts, any negative thoughts, any doubt, any imposter syndrome whatsoever. And that it's not until we achieve that we can be considered successful. And I don't think that's true, because frankly, the amount of work it would take me to get there, and anybody else as well, is like a time investment I don't have. I need to start dealing with this now. How do I move forward powerfully? And frankly, what if that stuff never goes away? Can I still be happy, successful, imposter syndrome free instead without it? Yes, by leaving the gremlins on the table. Now, that title came from a coaching session I was doing with a client, and she was really worried about her performance in an upcoming job interview. So she was like not even sure she was going to get the interview. The materials, were terrible. Her interview skills were terrible. According to her, she was, this hugely unsuccessful, nobody should trust her with anything type of person. And what we did is we worked through the field research part. And I said, well, what position do you have now? And she was like a number 2 in the IT department for a company that had over 15,000 employees. So data versus her story that she was kind of telling. Data says 15,000 employees size company is trusting you with the number 2 function in one of their most important departments. Okay, we're getting some perspective. Then we moved into, what do we do with these gremlins that pop up that are like, you're not good enough, you're going to blow it, you're a terrible interviewer, you're a terrible presenter, blah, blah, blah. Here's the image that we constructed. Was her working at her kitchen table, that's where she was seated during the coaching session, and submitting this application while all of these gremlins were still sitting around the table watching her, but doing it anyway. So that's the difference between needing to like pew, 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 and get the gremlins off the table completely, or let them be there and still do the thing. And when you do that, what you begin to notice is this. Yes, and yes, I can have this fearful thought, and I can still do this. Yes, I can have this fearful thought or this doubting thought, and I can still do this well. I can still land the job. I can still address the performance issue with my team member. I can still speak up for what I need. And all of these feelings can still be here. And what you'll do over time as you practice that yes and with leaving the gremlins on the table is you actually build up an entirely different data set in addition to it to say, yep, some of these are gremlins and some of these are like maybe these little cool like tiny unicorns that are cheering me on and think I'm awesome. And you sort of begin to like populate the room a little bit differently for yourself. Some of them may go away completely. Some of your gremlins might disappear, but some might last for a lifetime. I know every once in a while I pop up and I'm like, seriously, I'm still dealing with that. Like, didn't we resolve that in the early 2000s? Like, or at least, you know, in the last 10 years, this is ridiculous. So yes, and the gremlins don't necessarily have to go away completely. They can stay there and I can still move on and do the thing. Last strategy, and then I have time at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to drop that in the chat. If you have them, again, you can send them just to me. If you want it to be anonymous, that's totally fine too. So strategy number 5 is experimenting with what I call the BS bucket. Now, this was a strategy I originally started playing with a couple of years ago after I had left my career of almost a decade and a half, launched my company full time, and then immediately got out there and was like, who am I to be doing this? Like, who's going to listen to me, let alone, like, God forbid somebody would actually pay me for anything. And that imposter syndrome, all that doubt was really like in high gear. So I played with an experiment because I like the field research. I like to have my data to really see what's going on. And what I came up with was the doubt jar. And so I was building some awareness around my own thought patterns, but I also kind of wanted to see like how much of this is true, how much of my doubts are like actually coming true. So I bought a clear glass jar and I put it like right off to the side of my monitor. And I had a stack of index cards. And every time I had a doubting thought, I would write it down and put it in the jar. Then I would write it down and put it in the jar. And what happened was over the course of the week, I was like, holy cow, Nicole, you are having a lot of doubting thoughts. Remember, up to 80% of the thoughts we think are actually negative. So it built this really interesting awareness that I went, maybe there's some more work to be done here. So it was great for my self-awareness. It actually gave me really clear data on what my kind of painful or doubting or imposter syndrome thoughts were. And then what I did was at the end of the week, I would take them all out before I wrapped up for the weekend and kind of like clocked out for the week. I would lay them all out on the desk and I would go through and I would write yes in green marker if it was true, if it had come true. And then I would write no in red marker if it actually hadn't, and I would kind of sort my piles. Now, I did this the first week, and I actually ended up with 0 that had actually been true. And these thoughts, I mean, ranged from I'm not going to get any contracts to I'm going to mess up this presentation to people are going to know I shouldn't be talking about this topic that I'm really excited to talk about, but like I'm not the world's foremost leading authority on it. I didn't have a single one of them come true. So I was like, all right, well, maybe it was just a good week. So I repeated it for 3 more weeks, so an entire month's worth of data. And I will tell you that out of every single thing I put into that jar, I never actually once had any of it come true. But it sure gave me clarity around what some of those areas were and where I could do additional work. So I actually ended up hiring an executive coach slash life coach for that to help me work on kind of some of those thought processes. But that's why I call this the BS bucket instead of the doubt jar, because it started as the doubt jar. And then over time, I was like, oh, that's actually like nothing in that doubt jar has come true. Is that actually the BS bucket instead? And then what that gave me was the next time I started to have one of those thoughts and I was like going through the motions of writing it down or even just noticing it, I didn't even need to get as far as putting it in the jar because I was like, oh, that might be kind of BS. I don't really need to actually worry about that. So 5 quick strategies. Hopefully that equipped you with some of these. The recording will be available if you want to go back and look through them. So I want to tackle a couple of the questions that are coming through right now for some kind of like specific situation. So if you have one, feel free to shoot it over. one of the ones, how do you address some of these if you notice that it is your supervisor who has doubts and their way of dealing with it is to do all the work themselves rather than ask for help? Now this one's tricky because, we can control and work on our own behavior, but we can't really force anyone else into that. So some of this might depend on the type of relationship you have with your supervisor. Is this a behavior that you could talk about? Like say, hey, I've kind of noticed that you're taking on a lot of this. Is there, something going on? Could you help me understand more what's going on? I'm happy to help, or could I offer to help? So that's kind of one path. If there's an open door possibility of a conversation, center it around the outcomes of the behavior that you're seeing. So you seem like your calendar is packed. It seems like your schedule is just crazy, or you're working a ton of extra hours. I've noticed some of these and I care about you. Can we have a conversation? Is there a way to help? That way, it's not so much about what they're doing wrong, but it's about what you're seeing that you might symptomatically be able to address. The other one is if you hear verbal cues of this, so like sometimes you'll hear people shoulding on themselves, I should, or they'll verbalize some of that imposter, like, God, I always screw this up, or I know I'm going to blow it. See if you can help them with some of these strategies. Like, hey, I heard you say that, but can I offer some data to the opposite? Could I share with you like how it seems from my perspective? And again, what you're doing is you're never going to be able to talk them out of it. This is the yes and that's going to show up for them, but you can also add to some of their perspective. And then I think thirdly, generally if it's a micromanagement kind of thing or a fear-based, I'm going to hoard all the work. Any way that you can propose a path forward that will help them continue to be successful, which is really what their core desire is. I want to be successful. I want to be validated, while also addressing some of the workload issues in a way that feels supportive and not critical. That's going to be really the path forward. And sometimes, honestly, there's kind of I have to step back from this if they're unwilling to question that behavior or they're not willing to notice kind of what they should be noticing. And that might be kind of, I need to step back and then sort of like get my own house in order so I'm not caught up in a negative splatter effect here. Let me scroll a little bit because I have a couple more. I don't know if it's imposter syndrome or not, but I have an employee who's just not performing well. But every time I try to address the issue with him, I get nervous and back down when he pushes back on what I'm saying. What do I do about this? It makes me worry. I'm just not cut out for supervising. Okay, so employees not performing well, trying to address it, but kind of like losing that steam or losing that momentum. It doesn't mean that you're not cut out for supervising, and I would really apply your data points there very strongly. It may mean this is an area of supervising that you're uncomfortable with. So the totality of your supervisory role is much bigger than just addressing this performance issue. It's all the other things that you're responsible for. What it does also mean, though, is this is an area of growth for you. And this is a space where you maybe have some learning to do, some experience to gain. And that is a great place to get help from a mentor, an advocate. I always say, like, have an army of advocates, not just a network. Those advocates are people that will really invest this with you, perhaps with a coach to help you do some of that role play and get comfortable, get more, I'm going to say more comfortable, because not once in my entire career when I addressed a performance issue was I ever like, yeah, this sounds great. I can't wait to do this when I get to work today. It was like more of that gremlins on the table kind of scenario. So the role playing will help, really clarifying, like, these are the three things I need to come out of that interaction having said, and bring them with you. I took notes into those meetings all the time. Like, we're not robots. You're not expected to magically memorize it, have an excellent delivery, be present in the room, and capture every single data point and get feedback from them, as well as identify next steps. I don't think that's human. So hopefully some of those will help. Okay. Regarding the doubt jar, how do I prevent secondary feelings about my doubts? I often criticize myself when I reread journal entries. and I can totally see myself feeling stupid or petty for my thoughts or feelings after some time has passed. Yeah, been there, done that as well. I'm very familiar with. Actually, did it this morning. I was looking back at something. I was like, oh, such a drama queen 3 weeks ago. What was going on? Um, how do you prevent it? You don't have to reread your journal entries. Number one, but like, what's the point? If we're combing for good information, great. If we're combing for areas to critique, consider changing the lens. So if you're going back for things I want to pull out or things that were I want to make sure I'm making progress on. Um, a couple things. Number one, let those live separately. Have an action items or a follow up to my feelings journal so that you can just read that instead of needing to go back through the entire lived experience and process of how you got there in the first place. So, sort of separating that out. Number two, intentionally go into that if you're going to do it with compassion and maybe put like a sticky note next to it that says no critique, no secondary feelings, like clarify your assignment. What's the assignment and intent of what you're looking back to like kind of get out of that? I think that can help a little bit. That can really undermine us, right? Like I felt, stupid about the thing, and now I feel stupid about feeling stupid about the thing. Very normal, but that's a great place to also like step out of that spiral and say like, okay, spot it, stop it. Now I'm going to go get my action items and see if I'm actually doing these things that I wanted to follow up on. Okay, so we are at 12:59. I promised I'd be done at 1. Probably should have advanced to the Q&A slide about like 7 minutes ago. But here we are, here's my contact info. Second part of this series is in July. We're gonna be talking about transitions and intentionally, what can we expect in a period of transition, the discomfort, the challenges, what might be required of us, and how do we really make the most of those transitions? So I would say own your transition, don't let your transition own you, because those are often a point where we think like, I'm just kind of swept up in this, I've got to survive through it. But having a little bit more intentionality and ownership there. So as always, I love talking with you. Thank you so much, especially for being part of the Mighty Networks community. I'm going to keep rolling information out through there. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Feel free to drop me an email, connect with me on social media, and we'll talk soon. Thanks so much.